Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor political, nor popular, and he must take it because conscience tells him it is right." Let us spend some time in silence, reflecting, praying, meditating, or simply being present in this moment. Emma Gonzalez, 18-year-old survivor of the Parkland school shooting and lead organizer for the March for Our Lives, said, "We are going to be the kids you read about in textbooks, not because we're going to be another statistic about mass shooting in America, but because, just as David said, we are going to be the last mass shooting. Just like Tinker versus Des Moines, we are going to change the law." You know, it's funny the way time transforms the limits of acceptability. How it transforms everyone into a good guy. 50 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated while in Memphis to support sanitation workers on strike. Contrary to popular belief, when he died, he was not an icon of freedom and equality. In fact, most of the country disliked him. 2 years before his assassination, a poll showed that 72% of whites had an unfavorable opinion of King. This is no surprise, really, when you think about it, because he was at heart wildly radical. And his vision of the beloved community, or what could be, inspired fear and rage amongst those in our society who sought to maintain what has always been. And if that weren't enough, King refused to let those persons not actively engaged in racism sit on their laurels. He stated, "He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." In other words, those nice white folks weren't actually nice if they weren't working against racism. And when Atlanta's white businessmen gathered to celebrate King's 1964 Nobel Peace Prize, he stood at the podium and told them, "History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people." So you can imagine that even if some laurel sitters were sympathetic to his cause, when he called them out like that, they might also have an unfavorable opinion of Dr. King. History shows us that the rage he inspired transformed to violence as he and others who led the movement for civil rights and racial equality were killed, beaten, arrested, cursed at, spit upon, and mocked. But how quickly things changed when he was assassinated. Fast forward only 2 decades later, and by 1987, the white opinion of King had completely flipped. 76% of whites now had a favorable opinion of King at that point in history. No doubt they would claim that they had always supported him and the fight for civil rights as well. Again, time transforms everyone into a good guy. Certainly, some of this can be credited with society's general push forward to a more accepting and integrated country, but some, maybe even most, can be credited to King's legacy being whitewashed and the radicalness of his message against racism, militarism, and capitalism being buried in the process. Civil disobedience, King's go-to form of resistance, did not originate with him, however, as we heard in the story from Chelsea today. John Rawls, a former American moral and political philosophy professor at Harvard, described civil disobedience saying, "It is a public, nonviolent, conscientious breach of law, undertaken with the aim of bringing about a change in laws or government policies. On this account, people who engage in civil disobedience are willing to accept legal consequences of their action, as this shows their fidelity to the rule of law. Civil disobedience, given its place at the boundary of fidelity to law, is said to fall between legal protest on the one hand and conscientious refusal on the other hand. Acts of civil disobedience have occurred for centuries prior to our common understanding of it, the earliest known depiction of it being in Sophocles' play Antigone. But it wasn't until Henry David Thoreau coined it in his 1848 aptly titled Essay on Civil Disobedience that it became widely used. Civil disobedience runs in our blood, as you use. It is part of our heritage. We Unitarian Universalists like to claim Thoreau as one of our own, as he was born and raised a Unitarian. However, at the tender age of 23, he resigned from his local congregation for, get this, not being outspoken enough in their justice work. In a UU World article on Thoreau, the author wrote, "Were he to return on subsequent Sundays or visit other Unitarian Universalist congregations, Thoreau could be hardly more surprised to discover full-throated affirmations of other things he wrote and thought, elevating the life of the spirit over the material, an ethos of simplicity, reverence for the divine in nature, justice and inclusivity in matters of race, and the search for wisdom in Eastern, earth-centered, and other world religious traditions." But the Unitarianism of his day, though committed to many progressive causes, was not radical enough for him, and his essay on civil disobedience was his call to those high-browed Unitarians sitting in their ivory towers. Thoreau didn't just write about his beliefs, though. He lived them out. He engaged in an act of civil disobedience by not paying his state poll taxes, which were implemented by the American government to prosecute a war in Mexico and to enforce the fugitive slave law. In his essay, Thoreau observes that only a very few people, heroes, martyrs, patriots, and reformers, serve their society with their consciences, and so necessarily resist society for the most part, and are commonly treated by it as enemies. Thoreau, for his part, spent time in jail for his protest. Many after him have proudly identified their protests as acts of civil disobedience and have been treated by their societies, sometimes temporarily, sometimes indefinitely, as its enemies. A quick survey of so-called social reformers will immediately confirm Thoreau's conclusion that a reformer like Jesus, Gandhi, King, Reverend Dr. William Barber, or Emma Gonzalez, whom I mentioned in our reading, will first be met as an enemy. It seems that just as one must agree to being potentially jailed as a condition of their civil disobedience, so must they be prepared to be hated before their vision can be fully appreciated. And in some cases, it takes their death. King's death left us with a great hole, but his legacy has continued to inspire organized movements for social justice throughout the United States and the world. These movements have changed and evolved as needed over the decades. Modern civil disobedience has taken many forms, each movement taking a different shape to keep up with the needs of their particular participants and noted audience, each learning from the failures and successes of those that have gone before. Not all have accomplished their stated goals, though almost all have been victorious in one way or another. The water protectors from Standing Rock protested the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline that was to travel through a Sioux reservation in North Dakota. What began initially as a movement led by young natives, coming together in prayerful protest, became something much bigger, with supporters from across the country coming together to build a temporary autonomous zone, basically a small city of protectors and volunteers. It was the single largest gathering of Native Americans in the last century. Our own Reverend Peter Morales, past president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, along with many other UU clergy and congregants, spent time supporting the water protectors over the course of their standoff. Ultimately, we know that the pipeline was completed despite their efforts. In a smaller example of civil disobedience, interfaith clergy, including several UU ministers, handcuffed themselves to a fracked natural gas pipeline in an economically challenged suburb of Boston last year. They were arrested, and eventually charges were dropped as the judge found them not guilty by reason of necessity, essentially saying that the serious threat of climate change required them to act. Now, this is a seemingly small victory with major implications in regards to civil disobedience done for climate change. Many may claim that they were granted this leniency because of their positions of authority and perhaps their race, and you may be correct. While clergy-led acts of civil disobedience have seemingly risen over the last decades, MLK Jr.'s call to clergy to come to Selma with the president, set the precedent of using the inherent power and privilege that comes with the collar for the benefit of advancing a worthy cause. Reverend Dr. William Barber of Moral Mondays staged die-ins at the North Carolina State Legislature building to protest discriminatory laws, cuts to necessary social programs, and damaging environmental policies, and much, much more. As we are well aware by now, North Carolina has made some particularly egregious laws over the last 5 years or so, and Moral Mondays has had success in educating the public on what is done traditionally behind closed doors. They've mobilized a huge group of rotating volunteers to protest on a regular basis, risking arrest, and roused formerly apathetic voters to re-engage in the political process. They have seen some setbacks, but also great success as the movement goes into its 4th year. Occupy Wall Street, a protest movement that began in 2011 to speak out against economic inequality, greed, corruption, and the influence corporations have on the government, created a tent city in New York. While the movement has been highly criticized for its supposed lack of organization and questionable accomplishments, it was successful in raising awareness about its concerns. They began a national discussion on the role of the 1% of Americans who control the vast amount of wealth in our society. I think it's also worth noting that the movement was successful in transforming the political landscape as well. In raising awareness surrounding economic disparity, they can be credited with the success of Bernie Sanders, a Democratic socialist running for president on a platform of economic equality that was darn near close to winning, an unimaginable feat even a decade ago. And of course there's Black Lives Matter. This movement, founded by 3 women of color, is chapter-based and can be found in nearly every major city across the U.S., and in some countries abroad, including Ireland and South Africa. Like most of these more modern social movements, Black Lives Matter is inclusive of all persons. As they state on their website, we affirm the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. Our network centers those who have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. One of the most successful ways in which they've made their message heard is by disrupting business as usual. Their acts of civil disobedience in this regard have been wide-ranging, but if you've been paying attention, you've seen large groups of people take over busy highways in the middle of the day, or interrupting town hall meetings, or other typically straight-laced political events. Their goal in doing so is to push the urgency of the problem, as in, we're sorry you'll be 15 minutes late to work today because of our actions, but our Black brothers and sisters are dying. The March for Our Lives movement is the most recent act of civil disobedience. While the movement has mostly worked alongside laws, there are many who are prepared to break them to prove a point. Some of our youth here at GMUUC participated in the National School Walkout Day last month. In fact, millions of students, teachers, and staff across the U.S. participated, and the huge amount of energy behind the movement led schools and local law enforcement officials to change their policies in order to better support their students' right to protest. This movement has been student-led and intersectional in nature. They've learned from those that have gone before that centering the voices of those who are typically marginalized by society, and the press in particular, was of the utmost importance. They have refused to shy away from difficult conversations with intimidating adult leaders in the public eye. They've used social media to organize in ways some of us organizing in decades past could have only dreamed of doing. They are setting an example for future social movements. With each of these examples, and there are many more I haven't included, organizers are learning what works and what doesn't. They are pushing for change and at the same time accepting of it, fluid in their abilities to transform as needed. I think MLK would be proud. Some have called this the movement generation. Have you heard that yet? Mostly as a way to mock the moral outrage being expressed. They are tired of marches. tired of SJWs, or social justice warriors, and being called to self-reflection. They see each step of progress as an intrusion of their rights. But these are the same people who killed Abraham Lincoln, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the Reverend James Reed, a UU minister who was killed in Selma. The same people who chided their wives and sisters when they took to the streets to gain the right to vote. It's the same people who detested Social Security and Medicare when they were introduced. History always proves us fools. 85% of whites in 1966 felt the protest tactics of the civil rights movement hurt rather than helped the cause. And 65% of whites today have an unfavorable opinion of the Black Lives Matter movement. In a few decades, will this number be reversed too? I want to end today by doing exactly what we're discussing today. No, not engaging in civil disobedience, though I'm always up for that. I'm talking about aligning our actions with our beliefs and our words, and honoring the work of MLK Jr. and all those activists still working hard to create a world of true racial equality. BLUE, or Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, is an official organization within Unitarian Universalism, which is made up of and led entirely by UUs of color. Their mission is to provide information, resources, and support for Black Unitarian Universalists, working to expand the role and visibility of Black UUs within our faith, and engaging in justice-making and liberation through our faith. One thing in particular I want to raise up is that BLUE provides scholarships to UUs of color who need financial assistance to be present at our most important faith-wide events, like General Assembly. It is important that they be present as we engage in our faith's most powerful tool, the democratic process. Ideally, we would have people of all backgrounds able to partake in this process so that we can move our faith further towards the vision of the beloved community. BLUE has set a challenge for us to raise $10 for every member of our church in every church across the United States. So today I challenge you to do the same, to place our money where our actions, where our mouths are. So please consider making a donation for more than $10 so that our friends and neighbors who may not be able to make this donation will be covered as well. We're not going to accept this very special offering.